I have also a favor to ask for. Please be indulgent with my English, which will often sound a bit French. Admittedly, the topic also requires it, because we will now revisit an aspect of the siècle des Lumières in France. So, in the Age of Enlightenment, as an apparent paradox, surveillance of the written word, the book trade and public opinion in Paris was developed and sophisticated as never before. Theoretically, the Kingdom of France was still an absolute monarchy that had imposed, under the reign of Louis XIV, legitimacy of both its centralized police and a cultural monopoly on what was written, printed, and even said in public. From 1667, when the post of Lieutenant Général de Police de Paris was created, I show you the portrait of the first Lieutenant Général de Police de Paris. A significant part of police activity consisted in controlling book production and distribution in an ever more efficient way. We should keep in mind that a specific department, the 7th Bureau within the Lieutenants Général de Police in Paris, was in charge of controlling publishing activities and book professions. Police historians and book historians agree that this police du livre, book police, according to Daniel Roche's phrase, despite its low numbers, became essential machinery of the state during the 18th century, as the political landscape grew increasingly complex due to Jansenism, parliamentary opposition, philosophers, partis dévots, and so on. In such a context, real police memory and better information upstream on the growing number of affairs became an absolute necessity, especially in order to control those suspect professions that dealt with books and public opinion. During the personal reign of Louis XIV, a great figure of the Parisian police was already active in that field, Commissaire Nicolas de la Mare, author of a famous Traité de la Police, as you can see now, first tome, 1705, who is regarded in France as the founder of the modern police. De la Mare was responsible for other important matters in Paris, such as grain trade and subsistence supplies, but he was also known as a specialist in book issues. He left a quantity of interesting papers and archives, which are now preserved at the BNF Department of Manuscripts. Nicolas de la Mare was a man of action and culture at the same time, as Joseph d'Emery would be half a century later, but his practice regarding book business was essentially repressive, in the service of judicial institutions. De la Mare was partly specialized in books, indeed, but he was not explicitly required to exert a continuous surveillance on the book trade. This context became quite different during the reign of Louis XV. At this time, government expected more and more efficiency from the Parisian police, not only to repress delinquency, but also to anticipate it and thus prevent parliaments or other pressure groups from interfering and challenging government policy. As regards publishing business, the role played by the Parisian police did not only consist in prosecuting scandalous books, authors, and printers. Actually, it mainly consisted in being informed of what was about to come to light and in stopping it noiselessly in case of threats to public order. That meant being able to play the part of what we might call, what book historians call, a meta-censorship, an invisible censorship upstream from the official royal censorship, which depended on the Grand Chancellery of France, that is, a large ministry of justice. Inspector Joseph Demery entered on stage precisely when this need for better police information became essential. You can see him now at the end of his career. Demery was not the only police officer dealing with book surveillance in his time. Commissaire Aignan Philippe Miché de Rochebrune, who died in 1774, for instance, seemed to have been another specialist in book matters, frequently operating in cooperation with Demery, by the way. But Inspector Demery had, moreover, a prominent position of trust close to the Lieutenant de Police himself. Well, why did he enjoy such a privileged position? His early biography is a bit storybook, I would say, but it gives us a few clues about his career. It is true that Joseph Demery had a rather obscure birth. He was born in Stenay, in Lorraine, as the son of a maidservant who was in the service of a Prince of Condé's tax farmer, general farmer, and as a consequence, he was probably the natural child of a highly placed person. As a matter of fact, he was patronized and educated enough to begin a military career in a cavalry regiment at the age of 16, and to attain the rank of captain of dragoons at the age of 18. Just after that, in 1741, he bought an office of exempt, that is a junior police officer within the Parisian police. This stage is very important because at this time, police recruitment tended to favor those who had a military background. It has been well demonstrated by an historian, Vincent Millot, in his recent work, L'Admirable Police. In such conditions, Demery's career was one of the most successful and rapid among his colleagues. In 1742, at the age of 20, he married the daughter of a police inspector. He was then commissioned for several missions, especially the control of Parisian gambling houses. It was demonstrated by Francis Freundlich, another historian, in his book Le Monde du Jeu à Paris. It is clear that Demery was already considered a very trustworthy man by the Lieutenant de Police. 1748 seems to be a turning point. In that year, Joseph Demery sold his office of exempt and became responsible for enforcing regulations upon the Parisian book trade and inspecting book merchandise in Paris ports. In fact, he was already playing the part of a police inspector, though he effectively purchased the office of inspector only 6 years later, in 1754. Demery embodied a new generation of police inspectors promoted by Lieutenant de Police Nicolas René Berryer, as you can see here. Berryer was not only a firm-handed man, we could say, he was also a man of files, a man of information as well. He clearly encouraged his agents to employ a growing number of spies and informers who were called mouches, that is flies, in 18th century French slang. And maybe you can see the indication gare les mouches, careful with the mouche. Spying people in the streets. Berryer also meant to develop a sophisticated police memory by using identification sheets, the fiches de renseignement, registers and archives, which had to be carefully classified and preserved inside the fortress of the Bastille, the famous Bastille. That is why Demery's activity is partly traceable today among Bastille papers preserved in the Arsenal Library in Paris. The most important part of his archives remaining included in the Anisson collection in the BNF department of manuscript. Berryer's new kind of management was an incentive for the young Inspector Demery, who was already recognized as the most reliable and competent police officer in charge of controlling book activities in Paris. He had to develop his knowledge about those who earned their living from printed matter. We know that from 1748, Demery first compiled data about authors in a historique des auteurs, that is, an author's file, we could say, which included 501 men or women of letters. And here you can see, but it's not a very high quality picture, sorry. You can see Voltaire's record in this famous Historique des auteurs, a document which has become very famous thanks to Robert Darnton's work, and which is now published with critical notes on his own website. Demery also tried to make censuses of the Parisian peddlers. Moreover, he maintained from 1750 to 1769 a precious Journal de la Librairie, that is a sort of current manuscript bibliography, but only for police use. So mentioning the appearance of every publication distributed in Paris, legally or not legally. But a choice item among Demery's documents is what I would like to present today, the Historique des libraires et imprimeurs de Paris in 1752, as you can see, the title page. This file, which takes into account 273 individuals, had remained mostly unpublished till now. And however, it is a mine of information unobtainable elsewhere. I insist. In fact, it is not only based on official data provided by the Book Guild, Chambre syndicale des libraires et imprimeurs de Paris, the Guild official, it also provides information gathered from unofficial sources that include background details of the business, family, private life, predictors, legal proceedings, and so on, of many guild members. The Historique des libraires naturally aroused the interest of book historians in their quest for a social history of the work, of the book. But this is why I decided a few years ago to publish this document with critical notes in close collaboration with two colleagues, Marie-Claude Felton from McGill University in Montreal, and my colleague Elisabeth Keval, a librarian at the BNF, who unfortunately died 2 years ago. Finally, thanks to BNF Publishing, there is now a critical edition of the whole document with an introduction and also an interesting preface by Robert Darnton. When Inspector Demery undertook his filing, he did not start from zero. Parisian printers and booksellers were grouped together in a guild, which was particularly mindful of its corporative status and privileges. As such, this guild frequently published official lists of its members. One of these lists, published in 1748, was apparently basic material for Demery, and he carefully preserved it among his papers, and you can see it now, the alphabetical part of it. There is also a chronological part. Book professions in France were classified into the so-called métier de danger. It's an important notion. That is, trades that from the Middle Ages needed to be controlled by public authority. That is, goldsmith, locksmith, surgeons, barbers, apothecaries, and also book professions. But the Parisian Guild of Booksellers and Printers also belonged to the corporative elite of the capital. As such, it participated alongside the Parisian six corps, that is, the 6 most important guilds in Paris in the election of town magistrates. On this topic, I particularly refer to David Garrioch's excellent work, The Making of Revolutionary Paris, and more precisely to his chapter 3 about guilds and social organization. The Liste des libraires, published in 1748, included 193 masters and 64 widows of masters, for a total of 257 professionals, while Demery's Historique, drawn up between 1749 and 1752, listed 261 people. That means a near equivalence of both censuses. In addition, the inspector took into account a series of 11 provincial printers and publishers, and 1 foreign publisher, Marc Michel Rey, famous publisher from Amsterdam. Most of these persons were considered suspect and particularly watched by Parisian police. In his Historique, Demery did not content himself with the formal and thin data mentioned by the official list, as you can see here. On the contrary, he meant to collect information beyond the corporative screen of the book guild. Let us see now how the inspector managed to characterize each professional according to police criteria. And for that, let us consider first the typology of his records. The first category of sheets are dated 1st January 1749. It deals with a series of mostly blank sheets, as you can see, designed to be progressively updated, but we systematically find there first name, surname, specific branch, so libraire, imprimeur, both, year of reception as a master, if relevant, and the unique date, 1st January 1749, chosen more or less artificially as a starting point for collecting information. And just below, a few lines mention the address and activity of each person concerned, principal, characteristic of his or her production, titles, if relevant, morality, honest, suspect, etc. And as you can see, an important space remains below for possible updates that are sometimes added in a very cursive script, in this case Demery's script himself. And you can see the record of a famous printer and publisher, Jean-Baptiste Christophe Ballard, who was printed to the king for music. And at the last line, le 5 mai 1750, il est mort. On 5th May 1750, he died. Update. This set of sheets dated 1st January 1749 represents 1/3 of the total corpus of 84 records. In fact, it covers 2 categories of individuals. First of all, about 15 persons that Demery probably considered less interesting from a police viewpoint. About such people, information is reduced to a minimum, that is official identity and address. It mostly deals with widows having a limited activity in bookselling. The other category consists of persons having left or having died during Demery's filing. In such cases, the inspector only wrote "Il a quitté," he left or she left. "Il est mort," ou elle est morte, he died or she died. He added this kind of date until 1751 or 1752. Sheets dated 1st January 1752. Nearly all the other sheets, 169, are dated 1st January 1752. It probably deals with updated records that had been cleaned up later. These records are now presented in the sophisticated aspect of printed forms. An example, you can see, much sophisticated, with a series of headings, nom, names, age, pays, that is place of birth, signalement, description, demeure, that is address actually, histoire, that is more or less biography and career. Such headings by themselves already give us an indication of what sort of information was considered useful and expected by the police. And you can see here the record of a famous printer publisher who had some trouble with his cooks. We will see that later. Except for widows, names are presented in their complete form, with all the existing surnames. Mistakes are rare under that heading because the information contained in the corporative list was in general faithfully reproduced. The age, it is not a question of exact age, I would say, or registration age, but rather of apparent age. Age that a police officer might infer from the external aspect of a person. Hence, the obvious approximation we notice when biographical dates are precisely known. Actually, our Parisian printers and booksellers are often made several years older than they are by the inspector in charge of their surveillance. We'll come there after. For instance, Laurent Charles Doury, this one, print and bookseller, was said to be 35, as you can see, in January 1752, but in reality he was born on 18th November 1723, so it was only 28 in January 1752. The same for his cousin, more famous, André François Le Breton, printer and publisher of the Encyclopédie. He was said to be 45 years old on 1st January 1752, but he was born in September 1708 and thus was only aged 43. Pays now, pays, that is place of birth. This heading does not seem to be very interesting in a particularly closed and exclusive community such as the Parisian book trade, in which mastership was generally hereditary. However, Demery often mentioned places of birth, that is Paris, in most cases, even for well-known printer dynasties, such as the Ballards, printers to the King for Music, the Lamels, printers to the Farmers General, the Durys, printers of the Almanach Royal, other famous printers, etc. For well-informed circles, including police officers, of course, this kind of information was totally superfluous. On the other hand, Demery noted on only 6 occasions a provincial or foreign place of birth. For instance, regarding two important Parisian publishers, Antoine-Claude Briasson, native of Lyons, or Nicolas Bonaventure Duchesne, native of Saint-Maurice-Près-Valognes, in other words, Saint-Maurice-en-Cotentin, Lower Normandy. Here is the record. And generally speaking, information about foreign or provincial origins was rather vague. For example, Demery mentioned that the bookseller Rombaut Davids was from Flanders, he said. But we know by other sources that he was a native of Louvain in Flemish Brabant. And he was the son of the local burgomaster. The same for another bookseller, Étienne François Savoy, who was only said to be from the province of Champagne, but we know for certain that he was a native of Reims. We might say that the usefulness of the heading pays, place of birth, was rather limited. For my part, I assume that it was mainly designed for the author's file, Historique des auteurs, where Demery needed to place men of letters converging in Paris from varied provinces or countries. The same heading was then applied ipso facto to Parisian printers and booksellers with little relevance nevertheless. Signalement, description on the right. This is a much more original heading and a very instructive one for historians. As a matter of fact, at this time, physical descriptions of individuals were rarely present in official documents. Historians of identification, and particularly Vincent Denis in France, have shown that during the 18th century, these sorts of descriptions were only available for specific categories of population, that is, military men, criminals, poor and migrant people, or foreigners. So it is apparently surprising to find physical descriptions for members of a guild belonging to the elite of the capital. And we can be sure that Parisian printers and publishers would have strongly protested if they had known that the police were likening them to fringe categories needing to be physically described and filed, of course. To a certain extent, it is possible to perceive through these descriptions the police logic that was behind Demery's files. First clue in this way, the fact that only individuals who were particularly active deserved, inverted commas, a physical description, especially those established in the two main places dedicated to the book trade in Paris, that is Rue Saint-Jacques in the Latin Quarter, and the city place on the Ile de la Cité. The inspector certainly found that they would have more probably to deal with the police than poverty-stricken widows working on the fringe or poor devils selling second-hand books on the same case. In total, 67 individuals are physically described in Demery's file. That means a rather significant proportion, more than 1/3. Descriptions are generally brief and more or less impressionistic. For instance, Antoine Urbain Coustelier, printer and publisher, was said to be small and with a rather thin face, petit et d'une figure assez mince. Charles de Poyer's face is said to be brown, and the same for his beard, le visage brun et la barbe de même. But in more than 30 cases, descriptions include a height evaluation with precise figures. From 5 feet 2 inches, but in the ancient French measurement units, and I should explain here, a linear foot in old regime France was longer than its English equivalent. No, from 5 feet 2 inches, 5 pieds 2 pouces, that is roughly 1.67 m in France. For example, for Gabriel Charles Berton, as you can see here, he's said to be taille de 5 pieds 2 pouces. For the smallest, and to 5 feet 6 inches, that is more than 1.78 m, or even 5 feet 7 inches, 5 pieds 7 pouces, 1.81 m, for the tallest member of the guild, Antoine-Claude Briasson, already mentioned. Except for these nearly objective data, there was no really indisputable information that could have been shared by a third party. Demery often mentioned the color of hair, beard, and eyebrows, although the interest of such details was quite relative due to possible wearing of wigs at the time, and general beard shaving during the 18th century. On the other hand, our inspector almost never recorded eye color, which is apparently surprising, but Demery was attentive to other distinctive signs, especially visible on the face. First, marks of smallpox for at least 8 persons, and among them rather important characters, such as Christophe Jean-François Ballard, already mentioned, printer to the King for Music, Bernard Brunet, printer to the Académie Française, Pierre de Lormel's widow, printer to the Royal Academy of Music. Another recurrent distinctive sign was noted, faces said to be bourgeonnés, that is, having spots on the face, for 3 booksellers. Squinting was another detail worth noting in 2 cases, among which Antoine-Claude Briasson, mentioned above, a prominent guild member, who, as I noted before, took part in publishing the Encyclopédie. And finally, freckles were indicated in 2 cases, particularly for the active literary publisher Nicolas Bonaventure Duchesne, mentioned above, and here again, Nicolas Bonaventure Duchesne, who, unsurprisingly, came from Normandy. Might explain the freckles. Demery also mentioned in 3 cases a distinctive physical defect, what he called an embarrassed tongue, langue embarrassée. He notably signaled such a characteristic for 2 well-known and prosperous publishers, Laurent Durand, another co-publisher of the Encyclopédie, and Jacques Rollin III, important publisher. On the other hand, Demery's descriptions rarely encompassed other parts of the body, except when a characteristic was quite obvious. For example, as regards Étienne Auchereau's widow, he wrote that she was quite deformed and always needing to be carried. Elle était toute contrefaite et il faut toujours la porter. The inspector sometimes took into account aesthetic considerations. He thus mentioned une belle physionomie, a beautiful appearance, for Antoine-Claude Briasson, once again, or other ones, Jean Dessin, Hippolyte Louis Guérin, Jean-Thomas Hérisson I, all of them well-off religious publishers. Gabriel Martin, the father, a very famous bookseller, scholarly bookseller, who was another prominent figure within the guild, was said to have a very pretty face, une fort jolie figure. By contrast, Demery might signal, for instance, that Jean-Luc Nion II, a rich bookseller established near the Mazarin College on the Seine quayside, was very ugly in his face, fort laid de figure. Of course, it was not the kind of characteristics we could have found on passports of that time. Demery's subjectivity was deliberate and supposedly useful in a police environment. Lastly, unlike other descriptions known for rural peddlers or libraires forains, as we say in French, during the same period, dress appearance was never taken into account by Demery's file, probably because the dressing room of our printers and publishers was too diversified to be used as a distinctive criterion. All things considered, Demery's description mode probably derived from his background and expertise as a military officer and man of action. This would explain the importance he gave first to the individual's hate. This would explain also the importance of hair color in a social environment where wig wearing was not necessarily generalized. Thirdly, to distinctive signs visible on their face, smallpox, spots, squint, freckles, etc. And finally, to their corpulence and general aspect. Further details, such as eye color or facial features, were mostly absent, which tends to prove that the inspector's description mode was not intended to allow recognition in a face-to-face or in a bureaucratic context, but from a distance, in the street or in an open space. Actually, this kind of description could suffice to give basic instructions to informers for spying on such or such a person. That is important. Other heading, demeure, residence. This heading, rarely absent, was neither original nor fundamental in this file because all the official lists published by the Book Guild mentioned in which street was located the printing house or the bookshop of each member. Moreover, Parisian book people were not only subject to numerous clauses. According to royal regulations, specific areas were also assigned in the capital to the practice of their profession, mainly on the left bank of the Seine in the Latin Quarter, including the quays since the end of the 17th century, but also inside the palace and in the vicinity of Notre Dame Cathedral on the Ile de la Cité. That is why, in general, Demery just reproduced the non-detailed address mentioned on corporative lists, for instance, Rue Saint-Jacques, Quai des Augustins, Palais, and so on. However, in more than 20 cases, the inspector considered it useful to add topographical precisions. For example, Rue Saint-Jacques vis-à-vis les Jésuites, Rue Saint-Jacques opposite the Jesuits, for Marc Bordelais. And Marc Bordelais was a bookseller and publisher who was a steady provider of the fathers of the Jesuits and their college network after having served them as a domestic. So it was not only topographical. In a few records, Demery even wrote down a well-known and stable sign allowing the exact location of the bookshop in a long and populous street to be specified. This mostly concerned printers and publishers who were already prominent, such as Joseph Gérard Barboux, specialist of classical editions, Rue Saint-Jacques aux Cigognes, Rue Saint-Jacques at the sign of the Storks. And Pierre-Jean Mariette printed the police and nevertheless a specialist in fine arts. And you can see now the record for Pierre-Jean Mariette. And we also have a portrait of the character. A very good portrait. Despite these examples, detailed addresses were not necessarily a good sign in Demery's system. It also meant that the inspector recommended to his assistant and Mouche a particular surveillance of the persons in question. He thus wrote down very circumstantial locations for two former peddlers he visibly needed to keep an eye on, Mathieu Laurent and André Louette. And the first one had his bookshop Rue Galande, à côté de la rue des Anglais, chez Choisy-Chapelier. Rue Galande, next to the Rue des Anglais at Choisy's hat shop. The second one had set up a stall in the Cloître Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, chez un perruquier au fond de la cour dans le rez-de-chaussée, Cloister Saint-Germain, l'Auxerrois, at a wig maker's shop at the end of the courtyard on the ground floor. Very detailed. And a similar treatment was applied to an active printer publisher who was judged suspect and incorrigible, namely Jean-Augustin Granger. In his case, addresses were detailed in order to facilitate a possible search or possible seizure. À l'hôtel des Ursins, chez Madame de Saint-Étienne, au 3e. At the Hôtel des Ursins, at Madame de Saint-Étienne's place, 3rd floor. And à sa boutique au Palais, at his shop at the Palace. And now, the most important heading, Histoire, as you can see. It was in a certain way what justified the title of the whole file, Historique des libraires, and we would expect to get much information from it. Nevertheless, we remain a bit hungry if we compare the amount of data provided here with the rather abundant information collected in the Historique des auteurs, authors file. Even if some data unobtainable elsewhere were recorded in the Historique des libraires, Demery did not consider it useful to enter in too many details. On the contrary, his purpose in this file was more to summarize a lot of data gathered by inquiries and reports. At the same time, he had to characterize in a few words the profile of each printer or bookseller according to essential police criteria. Which criteria? First, if the individual was rich, very rich, comfortable, fort à son aise, very comfortable, or if he was or she was poor, misérable, destitute, or pauvre diable, poor devil. On the other hand, if this was a mauvais sujet, a bad lot, suspect, très suspect, very suspect, véreux, rotten, or even extrêmement véreux, extremely rotten. Or if it dealt with a person point suspect, not suspect, assez honnête, rather honest, très honnête, very honest, bon sujet, good subject, fort bon sujet, very good subject, or if il n'y a rien à en dire, there is nothing to say about him or about her. After that, the moral description might be completed by a judgment on the esprit, on the wit of the character concerned, on his or her talents, talent, merit, business sense, and education as well. Demery, in the end, had just to combine those 2 or 3 criteria. Laurent Durand provides a good example of this combination. Show you the example. Here, Jean-Augustin Granger. Laurent Durand. Il est l'un des plus suspects et des first line of the Histoire. C'est l'un des plus suspects et des plus rusés de la librairie. He is one of the most suspect and cunning within the book trade. Il a toujours fait de bons coups, ce qui l'a mis fort à son aise. He always made good moves, which made him very comfortable. As for Jean-Baptiste Claude Bauche, the first, c'est un cheval sans politesse ni éducation, c'est cependant un honnête homme. He is a beast without politeness or education, but he is an honest man. For the most part, such portraits were sufficient for a police eye. The inspector knew exactly what to expect and to do with the individual concerned. we just wonder if Demery's way of combining standard qualifiers was an innovation of his own, or if he was trying to meet a general requirement for standardizing police written tools, maybe. Anyway, the inspector sometimes added considerations relating to family or background environment. In general, these details were not much developed because most Parisian printers and booksellers were already sons or grandsons of masters in the same guild. But Demery did not miss noting if so and so was le premier de son nom, the first of his name, within the book guild. Gabriel Charles Berton, for instance, was le premier libraire de son nom, the first bookseller of his name. Et c'est le fils d'un polisson. He is the son of a scoundrel. Incidentally, the inspector often noted that the father or grandfather of so-and-so came to Paris en sabots, with clogs on his feet, which means that the character in question had rural and provincial origins, even if in several cases it was a slightly caricatural statement. Generally speaking, Demery seemed to be more interested in the few newcomers. He always tended to salute their success and rise in a very closed microcosm. Nicolas Bonaventure Duchesne record is the best illustration for such a trend. The inspector began by recalling that this publisher specializing in literature and theatre was a native of Cotentin in Normandy, son of a farmer, and that he had had a difficult start in his new environment. He began working as a servant and, he said, a été reçu libraire malgré toute la communauté qui s'y opposait. He was received as a master despite all the guild that was opposed to that reception. But Demery lastly wrote about him that he was un bon sujet qui entend bien ses affaires et qui fera sûrement quelque chose, a good subject who understands his business and who will surely do something. In this case, his prediction was perfectly verified. In his Historique des auteurs, Demery made author's file. Demery made sure to record family situations as well as any mistresses and protectrices, as we say in French. For many contemporary writers, marriage meant error or social declassification, and Robert Darnton came to the same conclusions when studying the author's file. On the other hand, in a corporative environment, characterized by stability and endogamy, such as the Parisian Book Guild, marriage was nearly systematic, and as a consequence, not particularly worth recording. So Demery did not pay much attention to conjugal situations, except when dissensions compromised the good running of the business. It was the case for this character, Jean-Pierre Auclou. I read, pauvre misérable, âgé et infirme, poor wretch, old and infirm, il vient de se marier à une nommée la grande Javotte, qui était colporteuse, qui ne l'a épousée que pour avoir une qualité. He just married a woman nicknamed the Grande Javotte, who was a peddler and who only married him to have a position. C'est un assez mauvais sujet qui fait enrager son mari avec qui elle se bat souvent. She is a rather bad subject who enrages her husband, with whom she often fights. There might have been some space left for mentioning private vices, and we can be sure that in a small professional group as controlled as printers and publishers, no gossip was able to escape Demery and his informers. But the inspector was apparently less attentive to their vices than he was to the author's ones, which were an important characteristic in his eyes. Certainly, he distinguished a number of drunkards, 6 at least, but fewer than expected given the reputation of book professionals, supposedly very thirsty. Likewise, the inspector mentioned few dabblers and very few paresseux, lazy people, except Christophe Jean-François Ballard I, already mentioned, who belonged to one of the oldest families in the book trade, and this was not a coincidence, in Demery's opinion. That said, our police officer had a rather broad mind, we would say. He seemed to be indulgent to human weaknesses, provided they did not present any threat to public order. For instance, Demery was not particularly embarrassed that Laurent Charles Doury, we already mentioned, quoique marié, fasse souvent des enfants à ses cuisinières. Although married, he often fathered children on his cooks. The important thing for the inspector was that Doury did not sell anything suspicious. Rien de suspect. But there was still something in common with the author's file. I mean the importance of connections, the good ones first. Some of these connections, official or not, were real shields for the individuals concerned, and the police needed to be particularly informed about the degree of protection of each. In Hippolyte Louis Guérin's case, for instance, Monsieur Berrier, the lieutenant général de police, en fait beaucoup de cas et lui a fait avoir la place d'imprimeur de la police. Mr. Berrier attaches great importance to him, and he made him have the position of printer to the police. Furthermore, il est beaucoup lié avec les jésuites et il ne vend que de bons livres dont la plupart sont de ses pairs. He is very much in touch with the Jesuits and only sells good books, most of which are from these fathers. On the other hand, Pierre-Guillaume Simon and his portrait. Pierre-Guillaume Simon fournit toutes les nouveautés à Monsieur le Premier Président et à Monsieur le Procureur Général. He provides all the novelties to the First President and the Attorney General. But mistrust, he was, according to Demery, l'un des plus véreux, one of the most rotten among the guild members. So, what was even more interesting for the inspector was bad relations. For example, connections with the Jansenist sect, which had several followers among the most prominent printers and publishers, such as Philippe Nicolas Lotin's widow. Actually, the Parisian police was especially careful with the rather numerous category of marron printers, that is, clandestine printers producing unauthorized publications. Demery notably mentioned the printing workshop of Christophe David's widow. He said, une des plus suspectes, qui a toujours été occupée par le nommé Bonin qui était son prote et qui a toujours marronné. One of the most suspect, which has always been occupied by a man called Bonin, who was her overseer and who has always printed clandestine publications. About this Bonin, by the way, Demery revealed that he was not the first comer. C'est lui qui a imprimé Thérèse Philosophe. He's the one who printed Thérèse Philosophe, one of the most scandalous books of the 18th century. Finally, needless to insist, this police file appears as a remarkable document about the Parisian book trade in the Age of Enlightenment, but it is also, in my opinion, a fascinating testimony about police intelligence work. It is true that Inspector Demery wrote records, not reports. His writing style, rather loose, proves that his file was first designed for his own information. Even if the Lieutenant General de Police was perfectly aware of his young inspector's filing work. Demery himself made the information synthesis, but he was not alone in gathering this information. In order to collect data, we know that all means were good, and the Historique des Libraires reflects that diversity of sources when it refers to rumors, gossip, reports, interrogations, consultation of judicial antecedents, bibliographic knowledge too, not to mention mouches, denunciations. This last but not least source of information actually involved a lot of people, permanent or occasional mouches, writers and journalists such as Élie-Catherine Fréron, other master printers such as François de Laguette, Jean-Augustin Granger, already mentioned, suspicious individual, printing workers such as François Bonin, already mentioned too, clandestine booksellers, men and women, such as the very recurrent Femme Folio and Femme Lamarche. Peddlers, such as Pierre-Nicolas Gaugry, who was Demery's protégé, later received as a master bookseller, and also bookbinders, etc., etc. Lastly, what was important was the quality of the information usable by the police, a sort of information that in general escapes historians, who are often dependent on more formal sources. That means opinions, affinities, occult and open protections, projects, relations, networks, and even sects, Jansenists, Jesuits, Parti Dévot, philosophers, parliamentarians, libertines, etc. We might conclude that what was expected from such a police file was the possibility of intimidating by the knowledge of weaknesses, deviations, and misdeeds. Information, as we know, is a huge and discreet power in the hands of the police. It allows one to practice blackmail, to recruit informers, thanks to give and give, to prevent temptations, to deter deviance, etc. The main purpose, in fact, was to prevent bad projects from coming to an end and to repress delinquency if necessary, but always with the greatest discretion, without any scandal, any judicial procedure if possible. The best manager of public opinion, and the Parisian police meant to be so, is the most hidden. Police efficiency in the sensitive area of opinion relied on relevant information, discretion, and anticipation. Therefore, behind each word, each sentence, even the most innocuous of Demery's file, a delicate judgment of the balance of power can be discerned. Depending on the case, this judgment motivated or held back the action of the police machinery. That underscored the autonomy that the police acquired at the expense of judicial institutions, thanks to its information work and anticipation effort. To know, not to have to act, or at least to act only wisely, without any collateral damage and without any noise, to tolerate small abuses in order to avoid bigger ones, as Monsieur de Malesherbes, directeur de la librairie, used to say. That was the new police ideal symbolized by the mass of information collected and digested by Inspector Joseph Demery in the Age of Enlightenment. His files, police memory in the making, were going to serve him as levers to reign over the Parisian world of books and writing during nearly 25 years until his retirement from the police in 1773, a time when the historical career of his documents was just beginning, and I'm convinced, and maybe you as well, now that this career is far from over. Thank you.